Hello and welcome to this video from the DCGist. In this video we're going to answer the question how to study for DCG. So to start off, what we first have to do is talk about what study sessions must look like and what study sessions should never look like. What they must do is that you have to produce something new or improve something you already have to make your revision easier for the future. So if you don't create something new, then there are times where you'll do your study and feel like you mightn't have really gotten anything from it. But when you make something, at least in those situations, you'll have something tangible that you'll be able to use in the future. They need to be interactive. They need to be engaging and they need to be rewarding. Okay, so sitting down, just reading books or reading notes can oftentimes not be very engaging and definitely not rewarding most of the time. You need to do it in such a way that it'll happen regularly. So you don't want to do it in a way that you'll do it once every so often. You want it to be interactive, engaging, rewarding, which will make it that you will do it more regularly. And you need to set a target amount of time each time you sit down to study, be that 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, you decide that, but you decide it at the beginning before you start. What you should have then is that your sessions should never be just with your eyes. So if all you're doing is reading or looking back at notes or anything like that, then you're not getting the most out of that session. So you should be doing something engaging, something rewarding, and something that you're producing. You can't be passive and it can't be boring. If something is boring, you're not going to do it regularly. And really what we're fighting when it comes to study, particularly as you go through your Leaving Cert year, is that the more study that you do, that boredom can kick in, and we want to try to make sure that that doesn't happen so that we keep up a consistent level of study throughout the year. What I would recommend then in terms of your time, so when you're thinking about your time, I would use the 80-20 rule. So when you're organising your time, you should spend 80% on topics, areas that you're least confident with, because you obviously want to get those ones to improve. But you also need to spend 20% on the topics that you're most confident with, because what you want to make sure is that while you want your worst topics to improve, you have to make sure that your strengths, so the topics that you're most confident with, that they stay the most confident as you go through it. So you need to give those time as well, even though sometimes it might feel like there's not much point. What I would recommend in terms of your time as well then is that once you've chosen how long you're going to do it for your study, I would do the Pomodoro timer, which is a timer or a concept that for every 25 minutes you study, you take 5 minutes break. Now, that could be 25 minutes, it could be 10 minutes and 5. And when you start off, it could go even longer than 25. But what you want to make sure is that you're taking a certain amount of time off every, 5 minutes every set number of times. So 10, 20, 25 minutes as you go through it. And decide that before you start your study. To make sure that you stay on topic then as you're doing your study, always, regardless of if it's with a Pomodoro timer, whatever way you're doing it, make sure you have a sheet of paper next to you to record anything that distracts you, because our minds are very good at remembering things, and that's what it wants to do. It wants to keep your short-term kind of memory going. So if you have something that's distracting you, it will continue to distract you until you write it down somewhere or until you action it. So if you get a text or something and you want to text back, your mind wants to text back and doesn't want you to forget it. But if you end up writing it down, then your mind will kind of be at ease to say, okay, I'm going to go back and look at that when I finish my study. So that makes a huge difference. Okay, so now let's look at some specific strategies we can use. I like to recommend a study level system so that as you're going through your study, you can see the progression in your knowledge, but also progress through stages, which then stops everything becoming boring and continuously adds to your notes as you go through the year. So it's always refining those notes, not always adding to them, but most of the time subtracting from them to get to the really important stuff that you need to know in the end. So first step in the ladder is I would engage with past questions. Okay, they're questions that you've done in class or questions that you've already completed. Complete challenging questions. So these are questions that you haven't yet done. So they might be from the end of the chapter in your book or in your exam papers, or possibly in another book that you might have separate to the ones that you use in class. Then I would use the Feynman Method, which talks about teaching other people concepts, and we'll get into that a little bit more detail later. And then there is designing exam type questions yourself, and that's the one that if you can get to the point where you can design effective exam type questions within the constraints of what the exam questions are, then you have a really good knowledge of the subject matter, and you're more than ready for your Leaving Cert exam. So before we start stepping on the ladder, what we're going to do is look at what we need to do before we start studying, okay? Now, I would always say that it's a good idea to look back over this, what I'm about to talk to here, weekly if you're in your Leaving Cert year, or if you are doing, if you're in 5th year or doing a class test, then it would be before you start studying for that class test. What we have is that you have to make sure that you plan at the beginning of each week or at the start of your study for a class test. So you need to sit down and plan what your study is going to look like. You need to rank your topics by how confident you are with them to help you allocate time. So I spoke about that earlier. So that in the case of Leaving Cert, that would be entire topics. But if it's a class test, it would be concepts within a particular topic. Then you're going to choose the 80% your least confident ones and your 20% most confident topics for that week or for that test. So you're going to write those down. What are you choosing to do that week? And allocate a time then as to how much you're going to spend on each one of those. It's a really important thing to allocate the time at this point, because what you want to do is that at the end of the week, if you look over your week and you know that you have a match on a Tuesday, or you have music lessons on a Wednesday, or something that's going to stop you from being able to study during that week, or maybe there's tests in other classes, what you want to do is be honest with yourself at the beginning of the week and say, okay, I have DCG study that I need to do. Realistically, I'm going to be able to do 1 hour. And what you have is that if you do that and you split that up in your 80 and 20 and you get to the end of the week and you've done 1 hour, then you can get the satisfaction of having done what you planned, okay? Some weeks it might be an hour, some weeks it might be 2 hours, other weeks it might be half an hour. But if you've planned it at the beginning of the week and you follow through with it, that will help you to consistently do your study week in and week out, because you'll always achieve something at the end of each week. Then what you want to do is organize everything that you have for your topic or your test. So that's your textbook, that's any notes your teachers have given you, personal notes pages that you made. So they could be Cornell notes that you've taken, which I'll talk about later. So that's the format that this page is in and the format that this presentation is going to be in, but I'll talk about that in more detail at the end. Completed questions that you've done. And then Feynman flashcards that will be created during the Feynman stage of this system. So at the beginning you mightn't have those, but as you go through them, you'll create them. And throughout each one of the steps, each one of these things, particularly, well, the last 3 are going to be constantly improving and evolving every time you study. So you're going to be always going back to these and improving them and refining them and making them easier to understand, so that by the time you get to your Leaving Cert, you've interacted with all of this information so many times that you know it very, very well. And the more times you interact with a piece of information, the better you'll be able to recall it in an exam. So with that, then we need to organize what you already have, plan your topics and time, but be realistic, okay? Think about your week. And then you want to always drive accountability to yourself. So you don't want to feel accountable to your teachers, you want to feel accountable to yourself. And if you plan that time, then that is what's making you accountable to yourself. Have you follow through at what you said you'd be able to do at the beginning of the week? Okay, and that's a really good thing to be able to say that you have at the end of the week. So in summary, then, you need to plan your study. Okay, that has to be done before you begin. Now that we've created our study plan, we're going to start doing our study, and starting on level 1 of our pyramid, we're going to look at our past questions. So what we want to do is that we want to engage your previously completed questions. Now, when I say engage, it's not just to look back over. Remember what I said at the start, we don't want to only do our study with our eyes. So with those past questions, we're going to annotate them. So that might be labeling, it might be some notes as to what you did with it. You can highlight key parts, so that could be the tougher parts in each one of the questions. So what's new in each question that you're doing. Writing step sequences, so going through what was your step 1, your step 2, step 3, step 4, that causes you to analyze the question to see what order you did it in. You can sketch out ideas or solutions, so that could be a solution that is similar to the one that you're looking at, or it might be a 3D sketch of what you're drawing, even if what you're drawing is in orthographics or something like that. And then you want to list the concepts that you've used in finding the solution. So that means looking back at other things that you've done and seeing what concepts that have been used elsewhere have also been used in this question that you're looking at. And if you do each one of those for every one of your questions, then that's a really effective way of interacting with your study and learning from stuff that you've already done. So it's really cementing the ideas into your mind. Okay. Now, you wouldn't do all of those in one study session, but over time you would do this. So maybe 1 week you might annotate, the next week you might highlight, and so on and so forth. If you're coming up to a class test, you might choose the most important questions and try to do all of these for the most important questions. That'll be up to you with your planning and how much time you have. So with the past questions, we want to engage with those past questions, not just look through them. And then in summary, we have to get the most out of those completed questions. We need to make sure that we've gotten every bit of learning we possibly can from the hard work that we've already completed. Okay, so adding more to those ones that we've already done. So you've gone over your past questions, and now you're ready to go and do some challenging questions. Now, you don't necessarily have to complete level 1 before you go on to level 2. You might kind of intersperse them between each other, and that's probably a good idea as you go through your study. So what we need is that we're going to look at challenging questions. Where do we find them? They're going to be questions from the end of the chapter in your book. So if it's a class test, that's going to be a really good place to find it. It's also going to be very good if you're doing it for your Leaving Cert. You're going to look at past exam questions in the topic that you're looking at. Obviously, a really good way of gauging where you're at. And then questions that you design yourself, which you'll see in level 4, which I'll talk about later. Time every challenging question, exam or a book, to see how close you are to 35 minutes for long questions and 12 minutes for short questions. It's never too early to start timing your questions, because when you get to your exam, you don't want that to be a new or a novel stimulus, that idea that you only have a certain amount of time. And if you get very comfortable with the fact that you only have 35 minutes or 12 minutes, then when it comes to the exam, that won't be a shock and you'll be well used to it. So it won't be something that will throw you off on the day. Just with that, after you've worked your way to level 4, you'll have an infinite number of challenging questions to do, because you're going to be designing them yourself. Okay, so the idea of doing the challenging questions is something that everybody really does in DCG, but it really should be part of the overall study and not the only part of the study that you're doing. So we can get our challenging questions from our book, our exam papers, or the questions that we design, and then we want to make sure that we time every question that we do. So completing challenging questions is important. There's no getting away from it. It's something that everybody will do, but as I said, it's not the only part of your study, but is still one of the most important things that you'll do. And don't forget that every challenging question you do is another question you can go back and do level 1 on then. So annotate it and look back over it and do each one of those steps. The next level then, level 3, is the Feynman Method. So the Feynman Method was created by a man whose surname is Feynman, and it was all about how to ensure that you understand the topic and to know that you understand the topic. And it involves teaching other people the topics that you're doing. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to do is that you're going to choose the content that you want to learn. Okay, that's obviously going to be important at the beginning. Then you're going to teach it to somebody else. Okay. Now, when you're teaching it to somebody else, there are really levels with that. So when you're starting off, you could try to teach it to somebody else in your DCG class. So they'll have some kind of knowledge of the topic already. So it's not like teaching it to somebody that has no idea what they're doing. And when you're teaching it to somebody else, what you want to make sure is that you note all the questions that they ask that you can answer. So when you teach it to somebody in your class, note those questions down, and then you're going to fill in the gaps of the knowledge. So what questions or which questions could you not answer? Okay, and you'll do this by going back to your notes, books, or ask your teacher. Okay, after you have done that, so for the person in your class, then you're going to simplify the explanations that you use. So the explanations that you use for when you were teaching the person in your class, you're going to say to yourself, okay, well, how could I explain this more simply? Okay, because we're always trying to simplify, and then think of analogies that feel intuitive. So analogies being examples that could work or things that are like what you're trying to study. A really then good thing with that then is that when you're doing the simplification of your explanations, what you're trying to do is to try to get your explanations to fit onto flashcards. Okay, flashcards are small, and if you can fit your explanations onto one of them, then you're doing a pretty good job. Now, once you've done that the first time with somebody in your class, then you can go and try to teach it to somebody that's never, an adult maybe that's never seen this stuff before. So it could be a parent or guardian, or an aunt or uncle, or somebody that just hasn't had any experience with this. And you're going to go through it again. So note the questions that they ask, fill in any gaps in your knowledge that you don't know the answer to, again, by going back to your notes, your books, or asking your teacher. And then you're going to try to simplify your explanations again, okay? Once you've done that, you'll have another set of flashcards. So you'll have now new flashcards that kind of supersede the ones that you've already made. So you'll have even simpler ones to help you to do your study. Then what you want to do is that you want to go back to the beginning again and teach somebody that's younger than you, okay? And go through each one of the steps. And what you want to get towards is that you want to be able to teach somebody that is 6 years old, okay? That you wanted to get down to the simplest possible way of explaining this so that even a 6-year-old child could understand your explanation, okay? Then just with that, so you choose your topic, you teach it to somebody, you fill in the gaps, you simplify, then you go through it again, teach somebody else, fill in the gaps, simplify, teach somebody else, fill in the gaps and simplify. And really what you have with that is that this is the way that teachers have learned what they're teaching. So as teachers go through things, this is what they're constantly doing, which is why they have the answers to most of the questions that you ask. Okay, they've taught it over and over again, they've heard so many questions, and that has helped them to understand what it is that they're looking at. And as you know, your teachers are experts in what they're doing for their subjects. So you can take those as an example. So the goal of the Feynman method is to be able to teach a concept to a 6-year-old. So taking a difficult concept or a technical concept and breaking it down into the simplest possible explanation so that you could teach it to a 6-year-old. And if you can get to that point where you can teach it to a child, then you really do understand what it is that you're doing, okay? And what you'll produce from that is that you'll produce focus and succinct flashcards that you'll be able to use then before you go into an exam with the simplest possible explanation. And what you might ask at that point is, well, if I have the simplest flashcards, how will I remember the complicated stuff? Well, every time you taught it to somebody, that will have been going back into your memory and you'll have been interacting with it again. And so it'll be much easier to remember it, and you'll be able to remember it from simpler notes, okay? And we really want to have the simplest notes possible, because when it comes to the week before, the day before your exam, you want to have simple notes, not lots of different notes that you're going to read through. And finally, we get to level 4, which is question design. Now, what you have with question design is that you have to remember that if you can design a question, you can do a question, okay? You're not going to be designing a question that you can't complete. Now, level 4, not everybody will get to the point where they can fulfill all of the fundamentals I'm going to talk about in a second, but this is the goal that you want to try to achieve, okay? If you're looking to try to get a H1, then this is really what you should be aiming to get to by the time you get to maybe after Easter or after the mocks in 6th year. Remember that you won't be able to design a question in 5th year, probably not before your mocks, but the closer you get to the exam, the more times you revise things and study things and create new content, what you'll have is that you'll have such a good knowledge of it going into your exam that you'll be able to design these questions. So the fundamentals of designing a question are that they must have 3 parts, so an easy part, a medium and a hard part. It's very easy to design a question that has one really difficult part, but having to break it down into easy, medium and hard takes a lot of knowledge and understanding. And if you can do that, then what you're really saying is that, okay, I have such a good grasp of this topic that I know what's easy, I know what's medium and what's hard. It also forces you to analyze exam paper questions to see examples of this. So when you're looking back at a topic and you're trying to come up with these questions, you'll be looking at exam questions to see that, and it's a good way to analyze exam papers. The next thing is that the solution must fit on an A3 page. Now, the thing is that in the actual Leaving Cert exam yourself, the sheet is bigger than A3, but the exam questions are made to fit on A3 pages, okay? And what that forces you to do is that it forces you to think about what size the different shapes are that are going to go into a question, and what the solution will need. So will it need an auxiliary? In which case, where is the auxiliary going to go? How will it fit on an A3 page? What angle is it going to go at? Are there going to be rotations? What's going to be needed for the solution, and then where is that going to go on a sheet? So if you can do that, if you can make it fit on an A3 sheet, having thought about that, again, you have a really good knowledge of a topic, and that forces you to plan the solution before you complete the question itself, okay? Very easy to come up with a random question without thinking about what the solution would be, but you can't do it like that if you need it to fit on an A3 page. It must be completable within 30 to 35 minutes, no more, no less. That's because that's how long you have for a long question in the exam itself. This forces you to get into the mind of an examiner. Again, it's very easy to create a question that's so difficult it would take you an hour to do, and it's quite easy to make a question that might take you 15 minutes to do. But trying to get to that sweet spot of 30 to 35 minutes takes quite a bit of practice, and again, a lot of understanding about what is easy, what's medium, and what's hard, and what's possible within the amount of time. So if you can make a question or design a question that has 3 parts, easy, medium and hard, that it fits on an A3 sheet and that is 30 to 35 minutes long, you have more than enough knowledge to be really confident going into your Leaving Cert exam. Okay, not everybody will get to this level, but it is definitely something that you want to aspire to get to before your exam if you're looking for that H1. So with that, 3 parts, easy, medium and hard, you're going to have your solution that you want to fit on a 3 page, and then you want it to be 30 to 35 minutes for you to come up with a solution. Okay. The summary then, if you can design exam questions, you can complete them. Okay. Very self-explanatory there. And what you'll have then is that the product of that will be that you'll have challenging questions to complete. Once you've completed those challenging questions, you'll be able to annotate them. So that's going back to level 2 and then going back to level 1 with those questions. And that's what I meant when I was talking about level 1 and level 2, that once you've completed level 4, you'll have a never-ending amount of questions, challenging questions for you to complete and to annotate, because you'll be designing your own. Okay. It's also a very good idea that if other people in your class are doing the same thing, you can swap questions, you can do each other's questions. And if you were to complete somebody else's question, then there's the opportunity and perhaps you weren't able to complete it, there's the opportunity then to do the Feynman method and to teach them how to do that question that you created. Or if they do yours and they weren't able to complete it, then there's the opportunity for you to explain to them. Now that we've looked at the 4 levels of our study pyramid, what I'm just going to talk about is the format that I created this presentation in, and it was in the note-taking method that Cornell came up with. So it was in Cornell University, and it has 3 different sections which you'll have seen throughout the presentation. There's the notes section, which is to record. So this is where you will put your normal notes the way that you would normally take them in class. So you record what you learn, use concise sentences, bullet points, or annotated sketches, lists, and paraphrase. So the way that you would take notes normally. So if you were using this kind of method, it might be in class as your teacher is talking, or as you're completing questions, you might actually create notes in this way rather than putting them onto your A3 sheet itself, and you could then staple them on from this. Your Cornell notes pages can be standalone notes or stapled onto question sheets. So this is just a method for doing it that I would recommend using. That's a good way of doing your notes. After you've recorded your notes, so from the class or from the question that you're doing, then over in the column over here to the left, there are the cues. So this is kind of reducing down what you've recorded into the main ideas, questions that connect points that have been said or that are in one of your questions, constructions, study prompts, and vocabulary. Vocabulary is important with that one because you want to kind of see patterns that happen with your vocabulary. So that might be in the way the question is asked or in stuff that your teacher was talking about. Okay, and that will be after the class or after you've analysed your question and you've finished your notes, you'll do your cues. Then once you've done that one, then the last one is the summary. So this is kind of reflect over what you've done, and it's to be a very quick and easy sentence that you're going to use to show the main ideas that are in this notes page and a quick reference. So that's going to really be for later on when you're looking through your notes and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's in that particular note sheet? And down here in that summary, that will give you a really clear indication of what's in there. And if you take your notes with this method, they'll all be organized. They will be looked through thoroughly. And again, it comes back to that idea of interacting with your studies. So if you've done your notes here, then you have to interact with those in order to reduce them down to make them into cues, and then you have to interact with those again to summarize them down into a really quick reference sentence with the main ideas. And all again, you're just interacting constantly with what you're doing. None of this is done just with your eyes. It's going to be done with a pen. It's going to be done on a computer, and will help you to remember what was actually in those notes. So that's it for this video on how to study DCG. I hope that I've answered that question for you. If I did, please hit the like button and subscribe and share it with your friends so that they'll be able to look through these study skills as well. And I will see you in the next one.